Brazilian soccer has a strong identity. The whole world has always recognized us, yes, as the soccer nation. Soccer has changed a lot over time, and we've just gone through another failed bid for a 6th World Cup title, with every exit coming against European national teams. That gives me a sense of two possible paths. Either Brazil is trying to fit an identity it has always had in soccer, which is no longer the way it used to be. Or 2, we're going through a crisis in this identity by trying to imitate European soccer and ending up playing a sport that's not exactly ours. It's impossible for us to talk about this without mentioning how the identity of our soccer came about. Our identity of dribbling, Ginga, deception, the so-called joga bonito, emerged in Brazilian soccer in the same way that the identity of any individual emerges. In the same way my identity emerged, and in the same way, watch your eye there, your identity emerged in the first years of existence and in the early stages of life. The identity I have, the way I see the world, has a lot to do with the experiences I went through when I was a child, when I was a teenager, and you too, whether you know it or not. With soccer, it was exactly the same thing. In the very first moments of Brazil's contact with this sport, during the people's closest connection with soccer, that's when the identity of our game started to be formed. And this story is really awesome. Let's break it down into 3 areas. There was a guy here in Brazil named Charles Miller. He was a guy from a wealthy family who went to study in England, the country that invented soccer. He spent about 10 years studying there, discovered soccer, and thought it was really cool. Back in Brazil, he told the guys, check this out. I went to England and saw a cool game that needs a ball, a field, and goals. I brought a ball and have the rules. Want to play? The guys agreed, but there's one thing. He was from a wealthy family. Not everyone had the means to travel abroad, study for several years, and then come back. Naturally, when he got back, he only talked about this thing with his own little group, the rich crowd. And then that whole group had a... Back in 1894, when he arrived, they had a pretty messed up idea of what society was, and they made sure that only people from their own little group could play soccer. Soccer was played inside the clubs, and they came up with a really bureaucratic way to keep poor people out, you know? Who hasn't had that friend who owned the ball? You'd go play kind of clueless, and then he'd lose. If he lost, he'd get mad, grab the ball, and leave, ruining the game for everyone. Who hasn't experienced that? So why did people act like that back then? They started charging an absurdly expensive membership fee at these clubs, and naturally the workers, regular folks, just couldn't afford it. Like the fee was worth months of a poor person's salary, you know? There was no way. So, in this way, poor people had a financial barrier to being able to play soccer, and if you were black, you had a second barrier. Besides the financial one, there was also a social barrier. Because even if a black person had money, they still couldn't get into these clubs, since you also needed a sponsor from the upper class to sign off and say, no, I'll vouch for this guy so he can join the club too. So, for those who weren't paying attention, just to make it clear, soccer arrived in Brazil only to be played by rich white people. Poor white people didn't play, and neither did black people, whether poor or rich. But then you wonder, how did a sport that was only played by the rich kids end up going viral? It's because, unlike the most popular sports at the time, which were rowing races, regattas, you know, regattas are boat races, those kinds of boats, and horse racing, to play those sports, you needed a ridiculous amount of money to have a boat like that or to own a horse. Soccer, man, soccer just needed a ball and a goal. That's it. Since it was played outdoors, you could watch it. You could climb a wall and watch. You could climb a tree and watch, or you could just peek in and realize, wow, this thing is cool. You just need a ball and a goal. And then people started recreating that sport, doing something Brazilians are really good at. What was it? Making do with what they had, improvising a ball and playing in the street, playing in vacant lots, playing on some little patch of hard-packed dirt. People used to get cow bladders from butcher shops, fill them with paper and use them as balls. How wild is that? It became difficult to ignore and exclude poor people as the sport began taking over the streets. And then came a club that we still know today, that still exists today. A club that thought this was nonsense and thought, man, I'm gonna take all these people who play soccer really well and who everyone excludes because they're poor and black, and I'm going to make a team of people who actually play soccer. And from what I can see, the ones who really play soccer are out there on the streets, man. Clube de Regatas Vasco da Gama saw a loophole in the cliques rules. The loophole was this. You could play in the first division if the team moved up from the second to the first, from Serie B to Serie A, and the enforcement of the rules they created to exclude these people in Serie B was much more relaxed. So Vasco put together a team of workers and black players, played in Serie B, became champions and moved up to Serie A as a right they had earned, and the clique couldn't do much about it. Vasco didn't seek permission to play in the first division with black and poor players. They forced their way up from the second division and no one could remove them. And Vasco was the champion in 1923. At that time, the Brazilian championship wasn't unified. The Carioca championship was the biggest one in the country. And Vasco did that and became champion, even with a loss. That's the moment when Vasco fans burst with pride. And that's when the great moment of building the identity of our football finally arrives. And the coolest part of all this is that the rich people, that little clique over there, realized that they couldn't beat the people who really played soccer and couldn't kick out the black and poor players through off-field maneuvering. They did, on a massive scale, what sometimes still happens today. They brought the racism present in society in general onto the field. How did that happen? Black players couldn't even touch white players on the field. That was considered aggression, insolence. And with the referees being part of that same clique, they could rough up black players and fouls wouldn't be called. It was that simple. Hitting a black player wasn't considered a foul. Any contact by a black player on a white player meant they were done for. It was treated as insolence and disrespect. Early black soccer players in Brazil faced only two options: to give up and do more or less what that guy who owns the ball does. When things get bad for him, he just takes the ball and goes home. Or else do one of the things that I don't know if fortunately or unfortunately black people are capable of doing, which was to resist. The way black people found to overcome the hostile and aggressive environment they faced in soccer was by doing what any biological organism does in its environment. They adapted. The way they found to adapt was indeed to find a way of playing soccer where physical contact practically didn't exist. And that's where the Brazilian Ginga was born. Samba brought onto the field the deception, the dribble. The dribble is the art of looking one way and going the other. The guy would sometimes just take off and end up here, leaving you confused. Early Brazilian soccer used dribbling to resist violence and racism on the field. What would become our identity in soccer was born out of the need to resist. The one who tells this story in detail is that guy, Mario Filho. Do you know who Mario Filho is? Mario Filho is the guy who gave his name to Maracanã. That's right, Maracanã is the nickname of this stadium. The real name of the place is Estádio Mario Filho. Imagine what you would have to do to get your name on the biggest soccer temple in Brazil. Well, Mario Filho did it, the journalist. He explains this story in detail in this book here. And then soccer over time, like every sport, changes, evolves, goes through mutations and everything. Soccer is like, you know, in the past it was one thing and nowadays it's something else. And this artistic style of soccer with dribbling and flair, which was predominantly played by Brazilians and is still known today as Joga Bonito, built a rich and amazing history of how awesome Brazil is at this sport. But what made us 5-time champions and allowed us to dominate futsal, women's soccer, beach soccer, and several different types in the past, that's not what's going to make us win the next 5 World Cups. That's not what's going to do it. Having that kind of dominance, being a powerhouse, racking up a ton of titles. Nowadays, soccer is different and there are other kinds of behavior. It's like in the past. Imagine that all these little balls here are soccer players. The higher one of these balls is, the better that player was. That's it. That's by skill level, let's say. As the game evolves, studies about the spaces on the field advance, as do biological studies about our body's physiology, so we can run more and think faster. It's like all these studies raise the level of everyone who decides to start playing soccer. And nowadays, after focusing so much on tactics, physiology, scientific advances and everything else, it seems like all the players are proportionally much closer to the ceiling that can be reached. The feeling I get is that in the past, a star player had much more room below the ceiling to stand out compared to the other guys. Nowadays, man, can a guy stand out? Of course a guy can stand out, but the ceiling is right there because of how much the game has evolved. We just saw in the 2026 World Cup a bunch of results that a few years ago we would have considered huge upsets. And in this World Cup, we said, man, that's crazy. There's no such thing as an easy team in this damn football anymore, right? The sport is so well studied now. It's impossible for me to come to a conclusion here and say whether Brazil's gap has increased or decreased. Of course, there's no way to exhaust the subject in one video and talk about this whole thing. But if we're on the same page about how our football identity was built, let's think about the changes the sport itself has gone through because of so much study, so much science, and so much technology involved. How much football has evolved over this time in terms of team shape, space occupation, movement patterns, and on-field solutions? Man, we keep hammering on this point in 99% of the videos here on the channel. And you who follow Futebol Maximo know all about this stuff. And now that we're aware of the general identity of Brazilian football, it seems to me that the formula now is to try to find a match between what only we have and current modern football. But the attempts to find this fit aren't as quick as we'd like. Does it seem like an identity crisis? It seems like we're no longer the football nation, but it might be closer to happening than we think too. This playlist here keeps you up to date on all the evolution that's happened in the sport over the years, rule changes, and everything else. Just binge it. Take care.